Hello and welcome to our webinar this evening. I'm Rose and work within the Cereals and Oilseeds Knowledge Exchange team based in the Northeast here. And I will be hosting you for this evening's webinar. So if we get kicked off, I think our first slide is housekeeping. It is. You're all on mute. Please put all your questions in the chat box on the right hand side and we will field those between us and do our very best to answer any questions, but please do ask any questions that you've got. We have a panel of experts here this evening that are keen to engage in conversation. The webinar this evening should be finished by 8:30 at the very latest, so please, I hope you've all got a nice cup of tea, sit back and enjoy the evening. Basis and Noroso points are both available. If you could please pop your details again in the chat box on the right hand side and we will pick those up and apply for the points. And like all of our webinars, this is being recorded. So if for any reason you have to disappear halfway through or want to listen to it again, it will be available on our webinar archive. So just to touch a little bit on our Farm Excellence programme, if we go on one more, thank you, Christian. The programme is about making real on-farm change, and it's a great opportunity to see the latest practical research, discuss the topical challenges facing farming businesses and learn from other farmers like we are this evening. It's our wide-reaching platform of now digital and on-farm activity, and how we deliver information to our live players. The platform includes all 6 sectors of AHDB. It features a network of inspirational farmers as shown on this map who open their doors to others to learn, share and create new ideas. Mentioning those 6 sectors and bearing in mind the importance of regionality, we are this evening working with 2 of our monitor farmers, Pip Robson from the northeast of the region and Richard Orr, who's based over in Northern Ireland. If anybody would like any further information about how the network works, subscriptions or how to keep in touch, any of our team here will be more than happy to help. So just a few introductions for this evening. I've already mentioned Pip and Richard Orr, 2 of our monitor farmers. I don't know, Pip, would you like to just introduce yourself a little bit further?
Yes, hi, good evening everyone. Pip Robson, I'm one of the farmer up in north Northumberland here. I run a mixed farm with suckler cows and arable crops. The cows are partially commercial, partially pedigree Aberdeen Angus. We grow a variety of crops which are all marketed and dealt with through Coastal Grains, which is our local grain co-op here. So that's kind of from approximately 800 hectares. Okay.
Thank you. And Richard?
Yep, Richard Orr, County Down in Northern Ireland. We have sort of a mixed farm as well. We're farming about 400 acres of cereals and potatoes being the 2 main crops in the rotation. We switched 7 years ago to min-till potatoes, which was a good step towards sort of min-tilling our cereals in and allowed us to grow cover crops as well. In the cereals end, most of our grain goes for feed, although we grow oats for whites or speedy cook for porridge. And we're dabbling in trying to grow milling wheat here in Northern Ireland for local flour.
Fabulous. We've also got Henry Cryson with us, who is a research fellow of crop protection at Scotland's Rural College, and Andrew Howard, who is a Nuffield scholar, farmer consultant and agronomist. Is that right, Andrew? There's plenty going on, or have I said too much?
Not the agronomist, not necessarily agronomist, but yeah, the others are correct.
So just before we get kicked off, I would please like to ask you all, if possible, to fill in the following poll. So what is the main barrier to further IPM uptake on your farm? Labour and machinery financial constraints, lack of experience and or knowledge, uncertainty around the effectiveness of IPM techniques, or high risk. So what is the main barrier to further that you feel your IPM uptake is on your farm? If you would like to tick one of the boxes.
Just give me another 5 seconds or so. Getting just over half voting.
Strong lead there. Uncertainty around the effectiveness of IPM techniques. So hopefully this evening, through between our two speakers, we'll try and look at that a little bit further, and the lack of experience as well. Before we get kicked off with Henry, is it provocative of me to put Richard or Pip, stick you on the spot and ask you what IPM means to you at the minute in time?
I'll go ahead. Well, for us, we're 7 years down the line of zero insecticides, so we are very much about trying to encourage beneficial wildlife to counteract some of the problems of not using chemicals. So it's anything we can do to encourage, I suppose, the natural habitat of the soil to be proactive and help us in the fight against the nasty bugs.
Yeah, so a similar sort of approach here. We don't actually use insecticides and haven't for many years now, and try to encourage wildlife through our stewardship schemes and stuff, and hopefully integrate more IPM into our system as time goes on.
Fab, thank you. So without further ado, Henry, a little bit of food for thought to get you started, but we're going to have a look at now of measuring adoption levels of IPM. So I'll pass over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rose. Can you see my screen? You can. Cool. Great. So, good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about a project that we had a couple of years ago. It started when I was working in Ireland. We found that when we were working in Ireland, there was sometimes a bit of a misconception around what IPM actually means, and the terminology can be a bit tricky around ICM, IPM. This is the sort of widely regarded as the standard definition of IPM. This is from the FAO. It talks about the integration of appropriate measures that keep pest populations to manageable levels. And when interventions are used, they're only used when they're economically justified. And when doing so, there's efforts taken to make sure that the impact on the environment is minimal. But more practically speaking, this is roughly how we'd sort of structure an IPM program. You'll see these pyramids all over the place when people talk about IPM. Broadly speaking, you've got your prevention, and that could be all types of agronomic practices that help avoid the problem in the first place. So it could be rotation, using resistant varieties to prevent disease or insects becoming a problem. Then you have this detection phase, monitoring and forecasting. That includes in-field surveillance, but also the use of decision support systems and weather models and things. And then finally, you've got the control measures, and they may be mechanical, they may be biological, they may be chemical. After that sort of process, you have the evaluation stage as well. So you can look at what you did, find out how effective it was, and through that understand ways it could be modified to get more effectiveness out of it in the future. So when talking about IPM in the arable sector, what do we currently know? Well, there's currently very little information on adoption levels and perhaps even less on perception of IPM. Why do we need to know more? We need to establish baselines so that we can monitor any changes in IPM practice, and hopefully through this process we can identify the barriers to further IPM practice and potentially some routes to overcoming those barriers. we decided that the best way to get the information we required was to speak to farmers and find out what they're doing right now. So we did a questionnaire, and this was over 4 study countries, so England, Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. And the farmers who we worked with and agronomists who we worked with through the process really helped us narrow down the questions to these 14 IPM questions and 8 socio-demographic ones about the farmer and the farm business. And this was to try to tease out whether there's any effects of farm business and location, things like that, on their growers' willingness to adopt IPM to a high level. So we had the survey, which only takes about 15-20 minutes to complete. The next stage was to develop a scoring system to quantify the level of IPM being practiced. And it's very hard to do this with IPM because there's so many tools and techniques can be regarded as IPM. So we took a very much holistic, sort of high-level approach to things to try to understand why people are making the decisions they are and what's influencing those decisions. Anyway, through this expert opinion, we came up with a metric to score IPM out of 100. And this is what that final metric looked at. So we have the weight, so the percentage score awarded to each of the 6 questions that relate to IPM practice on the right-hand side. And the questions ranged from how much your land is in continuous cereals, why do you adopt a rotation if you do, what are the main drivers for that rotation, what influences your choice of variety, and which preventative measures are you using to control all pests. And when we say pests, we mean any harmful organism, so it does include weeds and diseases as well. And that corresponded to about half of the overall score. But within these preventative measures, we do have questions on monitoring, surveillance, and control on that as well. And then we have questions about what factors they consider when coming up with an IPM plan, and also whether or not they're a discussion group. So you can see overall there'll be a score out of 100. This is what we found. There was the chart on the left shows the broad distribution of IPM scores, with the mean being around 67%. But we also found through our study that there was significant differences between countries in terms of the IPM being practiced. So those farmers in England and Scotland, on average, were adopting IPM to a higher level than those in Northern Ireland and then Ireland as well. So there are differences, and these perhaps not unexpected, different climates, different markets. But why are there these differences? There must be other reasons. To try to pull out what the differences were between those lower adopters and the higher adopters, we split the group. So we took the top 25%, the higher adopters, and the bottom 25%, the lower adopters, and we looked at their scores and the answers they were giving to each of those 6 questions. What we can see is that those higher adopters of IPM were much more likely to consider many factors when creating pest management plans. They were thinking about the rotation, any decision support systems, monitoring, surveillance, so what's happening in previous years, and lots of other sort of bits of information that allow you to make a best IPM decision possible. So we know there are differences between the higher groups and the lower groups, but what's driving those differences? When we did the analysis, we found that having a perceived high familiarity with IPM was a good driver of IPM score. So those growers that thought themselves very familiar with IPM practices typically had achieved much higher IPM scores. Those farmers that had a good relationship with their advisor and relied on them and used their advice and made decisions based on that had high levels of IPM uptake. The higher IPM adopters considered biological control methods as being very important, and they were typically of a larger farmed area. There's many reasons that this could be affecting IPM uptake. Those of a larger farmed area potentially had the capacity to to buy in more machinery, buy in more labour, and as a result, and potentially buying more advice, as well as being able to potentially grow more crops on the farm and have a more diversified rotation and things like that. And we also saw there was a country effect, which is just seen. So this was something that was really quite interesting that came out of it. So as I said, farmers were asked to state their familiarity with IPM on a 1 to 5 scale, 5 being very familiar. And we found that this did correlate with IPM scores. So the more familiar you are with IPM practices and IPM generally, the more likely you were to adopt IPM to a higher level. And this makes sense. You have to have the knowledge to be able to implement the practices. However, there was a lot of variation around this line of best fits. So you can see in the bottom right, for example, there are growers that are deeming themselves to be very familiar with IPM, but they're not really adopting IPM to a high level. And there may be all sorts of constraints placed on these growers. And they may be locked into a high input, high output system. There may be environmental constraints. They can't do all of the techniques that they want to do, including growing more diversified sort of crops. On that as well, if you look in the top left of the chart, you can also get growers that are deeming themselves to be very unfamiliar with IPM practices, but they're actually adopting IPM to a high level. And some of this could be issues around the terminology of IPM. Perhaps it's not used so much, even though people are talking about selecting varieties based on disease resistance and rotation and things like that. Perhaps that's not being termed IPM, so there could be some issues there around terminology. So if we can upskill people and be quite honest about what sort of responses they're going to get from the IPM measures they're putting in, what sort of risks are present. Interacting with your agronomist is probably the best way you're going to have to do that. They're going to understand your farm, your situation much more than anyone else would be able to. And we did find that those higher adopters were the ones that used an agronomist, and also when asked to rank their top 3 information sources, those higher adopters of IPM were more likely to cite an independent agronomist as one of their top 3 sources of advice. However, when looking at the lower IPM group, they were more likely to cite the merchant agronomist as one of their top 3 sources of advice. And there could be many reasons for this. We're not making any judgment because we weren't able to gather such information on the quality of the information that's provided by the different types of agronomist. It may be that the lower adopters, perhaps of a slightly smaller farmed area, something we found, they may be more likely to go to one place to get their products, their plant protection chemicals, and their varieties, seeds and everything. So they may not be looking to pay an independent agronomist for advice when they can go to the merchant and get it one-stop shop. Also interestingly, those that rely more heavily on passive sources of information coming from like the farming pest, so one-way flow of information, were more likely to be in the lower adoption group. So when talking about increasing IPM adoption, we found in this study that all farmers had adopted IPM to some extent. And the high adopters had higher levels of familiarity with IPM. They had good relationships with their advisor and worked with them to come up with a pest management solution. They considered as much as possible when designing a pest management plan. So rather than just thinking about the pest and ways to control that pest, they're thinking about the impact of that practice, that control measure on other pests, on beneficial insects, on the crop, and on the wider environment as well. And they were typically of a larger farmed area as well. So crucially, we found that the high adopters were those that actively seek IPM advice. They're going to the experts at crop walks, open days, they're using their agronomists well, and they're much more likely to achieve a higher IPM score, be adopting IPM to a higher level. There's a lot of issues we perceive out there about the amount of information that's given to growers on IPM from various different sources. Crucially, we think this advice must be clear and consistent. and it must be evidence-based. So independent studies looking at the effectiveness of combinations of IPM techniques. So rather than just looking at varieties, fungicides, we're looking at tillage regime, position and rotation, sowing date, these sorts of things. And by conducting these trials, we should hopefully be able to start putting values or rough values on the sort of response you'd expect from those different combinations of IPM techniques in the field. And crucially, IPM adoption is the responsibility of all the stakeholders. There can be certain barriers in the supply chains that prevent people from adopting IPM to a higher level. So keeping those lines of communication open across the supply chain is important. That work I've just presented on the IPM surveys has turned into the new revised versions of the IPM plan, which you can find on the NFU website and the Scottish Plant Health Centre website. These we've been working with the voluntary initiative and the NFU to develop these, largely based on the survey we originally came up with, but it's been sort of added to and made more specific for the UK in doing so. So please, I'd like to urge you all to visit the NFU website. If you're in Scotland, visit the Plant Health Centre website and complete your IPM plan. Hopefully it will be a useful process, and you'll hopefully gather some key bits of information that you can use to develop your strategy for IPM going forward. We'll be using these plans to look at the different types of guidance that can be provided to farmers. This is a DEFRA-funded project that the NFU and ADAS are also involved with. We'll be looking at the 3 different groups. Basically, it will be sort of basic guidance, workshops, or one-to-one tuition. And we'll be looking at how farmers in different sectors, so we'll be covering horticulture and grassland as well. It will look to how these different farmers in the different sectors respond to the different types and different levels of advice that are given. And hopefully there should be something interesting coming out of that in the future with regards to the sort of training that's required to really raise our levels in terms of IPM uptake. And I think that's it from me. So Christian, can you take back control?
That's him. Are we all there again? Fab. You're all still here. So throwing the floor to you guys then, and Andy, you as a farmer as well. What do you think? How's your uptake?
How's our uptake, or?
Yeah. Or is it a barrier?
Is what a barrier? Sorry.
So just having listened to Henry's presentation, what do you think?
It's complex. IPM is not one single thing, and that's probably the mindset difference, I suppose. You've got to think of the whole farm instead of just what comes out of one can. That kind of shows in the results, I think.
Yeah. And Richard, Pip, any further comments?
Yeah, I suppose just maybe for Henry, is something I was thinking of going along there. You know, how important is it that the farmer understands his whole rotation and how the leading crop will affect the following crop, rather than just, oh, I grow wheat and I grow whatever, and understanding how your whole farm works as a massive rotation, not to harbour the negative predators, etc. And I suppose focusing that maybe slightly too on cover crops. Sometimes you hear just throw in something cheap and cheerful or whatever, but the wrong cover crop can be detrimental, you know, and the right cover crop can be very beneficial. I think, as you're saying there about getting the right information out, it's important that the whole thing goes as a picture, you know, and understanding that.
Yeah, I mean, you make some good points there. It's about understanding the effect of your practices in space and time, because what you do now, well, you guys will know better than I. If you do something bad now and you don't manage a weed properly or whatever it may be, introduce a soil-borne pathogen onto the farm or a soil-borne pest that's going to persist for a long time, you could be chasing your tail and trying to deal with this problem for a long time to come. So cover crops, this being sort of leading into Andy's, is no exception to this. If it's done without the right advice and without the right information, you could be setting yourself up for issues down the line. You could be, so in a more diverse cover crop mixes, if some species are allowed to set seed, they could present weed problems down the way. If you're growing brassicas as a cover crop, that acts as a host for club root, so that could potentially have a detrimental effect on other brassicas, such as also raping irritation. And there's a few other diseases, sclerotinia, that can be carried over through cover crops. So again, it's chucking something in is probably not the best idea until you've done a little bit of homework to find out if you're going to be creating yourself a massive headache.
Yeah, I think you might find that mixed farmers, you know, with traditional sort of rotation, will find it easier to go down this route, because some of what they're doing is they're already doing what they need to do and just need to tweak it a little bit. And I think as people in general awareness it gets better and knowledge gets better about it, people will go down that route because they just need to tweak something rather than, you know, do a fundamental change. Maybe it's a bigger step for some of these guys who practice monoculture, but hey, we'll see.
Yeah, I think there's always something more you can be doing in terms of IPM uptake. You're right. Usually we see this sort of sequential uptake. People will get a new, I don't know, bit of gear or something like that, and they test it out or start growing a different crop. But it doesn't need to be massive sort of wholesale changes. It's something that can be added to and tweaked over time, and I think that's crucial about IPM. As we showed in our study, everyone's doing it to some level, so it doesn't need to be are you practicing IPM or are you not? We know that it doesn't work like that. It's very much a scale.
So, Pip, we'll go to you with this one, but I'll be interested to hear what you all think. But do you, as a panel, think that you can achieve IPM on your own farm scale, or do you think it needs cooperation and community farming, e.g., coordination of rape growing?
Yes, interesting one.
And then following on from there, sorry, you say that mixed farming makes it easier, but is that essential?
It's not essential, definitely not. And everybody's farm's different. So I guess, you know, you're going to go down what suits your farm best. To a degree, mixed farms will tend to have grass and stuff, more grass in their rotations, etc. I tend to have a mosaic of field of rotational, you know, and something to grow with strict rotational method on the farm, and haven't really practiced monoculture. So I think it should be easier to integrate it in, and as we get more knowledgeable about it, getting farmers to cooperate may be a way, you know, because you don't want to end up with great big blocks of rape right next to each other. That might be interesting, though. It depends how you get on with your neighbours, you know, sorting that one out. Yeah, you know, and you know, there's a lot to be said for stewardship schemes and ELMS as it comes along. You know, if we create some good wildlife corridors, which, you know, that you do want cooperation with your neighbours there, so you know, make corridors. It's not no point having a corridor nowhere. So yeah, it should be integrated, and a bit of cooperation would be good.
Richard, what would you think about community farming?
I think as Pip touched on, it would be getting on with all your neighbours to coordinate that. That's taking it a wee bit to something farmers don't really like, if I'm honest. On a wider scale, don't like being controlled as to what they should and shouldn't do. So I don't think it would go down too well. I know in this area with us, because in Northern Ireland it is majority mixed farm and we are high majority of grass and cows, that doesn't become much of an issue for us really. You as your farmer yourself is in charge really of your rotation and what happens next door to you in many ways. We're not on a big enough scale that we have massive blocks of one. I can understand if you were in parts of England where there's thousands of acres of the same crop, field after field, it's not ideal. But again, that's really down to that farmer maybe putting every other field into a different crop, which is still easily managed rather than every field. But yeah, I think as Pip touched on it as well, environmental stewardship schemes and stuff, we're in the EFS scheme here, but one of the issues I have is it's run by people that don't understand how farms work. So if you're told to sow a 10-meter strip, but you have a 3-meter drill, how is that possible? And you're told you have to put it in one block, whereas why would it not be sensible, as Pip says, to put it somewhere sensible rather than nowhere that's just on the edge of somewhere out of the way? Make it work for you. And they should be encouraging you to make it work for you. And if you can come with a sensible reason for why you want it there, that should be perfectly acceptable, rather than, again, it's down to being dictated to how you do it and where you do it, which unfortunately isn't always coming from an educated background. You know, ask the farmers for a wee bit of advice sometimes is maybe as good a thing as any.
Logical, yeah. And then Andy, if you could wind the clock back 10 years, what would you do differently to adopt IPM quicker?
I don't think it's not a quick process. I think you've got to learn what that happens on your farm. My farm's gonna be different to Pip's, to Richard's, because we're in different areas. So I don't think there is a way of doing it quickly. You have to observe what's going on your farm and your rotation. So yeah, speed maybe isn't very easy in IPM. The sooner you start, the better. Is probably the best thing I'd say. But I don't think there's anything I'd necessarily change. It's just interesting. Just observe, really. Observe what's going on. Sit back and observe.
So sorry, just jump in there, Rose. I just want to say, so some things are, as Andy says, some things you do need to start putting the groundwork in early. If you're same as if you're looking to improve the soils, you're not going to get a quick fix then and there, very rarely anyway. And IPM is the same. You can have some things just dropping a fungicide spray, for example, in the year where you don't need it, or changing a variety to something that's more disease resistant. So there are some things, some relatively sort of quick, easy wins when talking about IPM, rather than sort of the full scale. Everything I do is towards IPM, and there's everything in between, obviously.
Fab. Right, I think we've just got another 2 polls, haven't we? But that leads quite nicely into Andy's presentation. So what do you think? Do you regard cover cropping as an IPM technique? Yes, no, and in certain situations. So what do you all think? Do you regard cover cropping as an IPM technique? Yes, no, or in certain situations? Ah, interesting. But the majority are saying yes, they do require cover cropping as an IPM technique. And then the second poll, in your experience, cover crops often result in, and please select one, more problems with disease, insects, pests and weeds, fewer problems with disease, insects, pests and weeds, or no change in problems with disease, insects and weeds. So in your experience, cover crops often result in more problems, fewer problems, or no change in problems. no change being the majority of the answer, or followed by fewer problems. Well, that's good to see. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Andy. I'd semi be interested to do that poll again at the end and see if anybody's perceptions have changed at all. But thank you very much.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, right. Let me just get rid of this. It's covering it up. Oh, oh. Has that disappeared now?
No, we can still see and hear you. All good as you are.
I can't see it this side. Sorry. Where's it gone? There we go.
Give me a shout if you want me to run it from my end, but I'll leave you.
I've got it now. That's fine. Right. Good evening. Sorry about that. It's always the technicals that catch you off, even though I've done it quite a few times. So this evening I am going to be speaking until Rose kicks me off, or I've probably got half an hour or so, and just on experience on our farm of growing cover crops, good, bad, ugly, and also I'm going to do intercropping, which is what my Nuffield scholarship in 2015 was on, and experiences we've had on the farm in terms of IPM and intercropping. Those are the bits that really excite me, is the intercropping and the IPM. You can still see some real differences, which I'll show you later. But just to, I've lost control.
No bother. Would you want me to run it from mine? Would that be easier?
Yes, please. I don't know why it's not going backwards or forwards.
Don't worry, all good.
Oh, it is now. I've got it now. I've got it now.
Oh, okay. I can go back to you then. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So, right, wait a minute, get rid of that. So we're just a 300 hectare family farm, all arable, no till since 2011 and been cover cropping since then as well. Actually, I did some cover cropping in 2007, which wasn't very successful.
Sorry to jump in. We're not viewing your screen currently, just a heads up.
Oh dear. Okay, you do it then.
Okay.
You there?
Yep. Yep, good to go when you're.
I've got to move on then, please. So yeah, I've been in cover cropping since then, and intercropping since 2012, 2013 in different kind of ways. Move on, please. And again. And again. So I haven't updated this to 2021, but it's very similar to 2020, our rotation. And I guess Henry kind of touched on this, that rotation is the probably one of the biggest ways you can affect IPM, and the way I like to do it is by growing lots of different crops, wheat, winter crops, spring crops, perennial crops, which is a herbage seed, which is good for weeds, and the intercrops as well. So that's for us, it's probably our biggest way of influencing farm, and it's what I kind of recommend anyone does if they're just growing 2-3 crops. Personally, I don't think that's enough, and you're going to run into troubles. Next slide. So this is my long-term goal. It's kind of after Nuffield, is to have a farm system where I don't have to do very much and I don't have to buy much in. There's lots of things you can spend money on, inputs, especially new inputs that can do magic things, etc., that are now getting pushed. Now the chemical pesticide side is disappearing and not working. There's suddenly new stuff on the market. My farm system is trying to do that without buying stuff in as much as possible. Whether I ever get to zero, I doubt it, but I'm trying. And for me, next one question, for me, the key to it is diversity. Diversity in everything. Crops you grow, cover crops you grow, intercrops, everything is diversity. Time you plant, diversity is key to this whole thing. Next, please. And next. And next. So with our cover crops, next one, please. That's it. Thank you. We have different mixtures we use on the farm. Firstly, they're mostly the same. There's just a few nuances between the two, but as you can see, we always use a minimum of sort of 7-8 different species. I do find it frustrating when someone says, "Oh, cover crops didn't work for me," and I say, "Well, what did you do?" Well, my agronomist said mustard's cheap, so I just put a load of mustard in. I had terrible problems with slugs. Everything in the ground stayed wet. It's like, well, that's not the cover crop that's the issue. It was the management. Being cheap isn't necessarily the best thing, and single species certainly isn't a very good thing. These cover crop mixes cost us about £30 to £35 a hectare, which isn't too bad, I don't think. We get most of that cost back from grazing because we have someone else graze it. So for us, it's fairly cost neutral. The differences between these two, one is before a non-cereal, so we've got oats in there, and we haven't got any brassicas. We have found that growing brassicas before things like spring beans or spring peas, the radish can sprout again and become a weed, which is one thing. And if you put too much radish in any cover crop, you'll get slugs or mustard. So the radish is normally brassicas are kept to a pretty low number. And the other one is before cereal cash crops, where we drop the oats. The reason we do that is because we found in the past that if we keep the oats and the volunteer wheat, say before a spring barley, the volunteer wheat can bring take all into our spring barley. So anywhere before a spring cereal, I like to be able to control any volunteer cereals. So that's why we don't have the oats in there, and we use a radish instead to sort of suck up the nitrogen as well. But for me, this works well for me. For you, wherever you are in the country, it could be slightly different, but just keep it diverse and keep it relatively cheap. You don't need to spend £60, £70 a hectare on cover crop seed. Next then, please. So slugs, as I mentioned with the mustard, slugs is one of the common things that people have issues with cover crops. And I guess to start with, we did. Though I think one of the biggest issues with slugs is if you grow oilseed rape, but also the propensity in the last 5-10 years with cover crops is to have a lot of brassicas and radish in your cover crops because they give you a big taproot, and you can put that picture on Twitter of that big radish breaking up your ground. Unfortunately, that radish probably is harboring 20 or 30 slugs. Next one, please. So for me, can cover crops make slugs worse? Next, please. Yes, of course it can. If they're managed, not managed properly, too many brassicas mainly. Next slide. And keep going. But can cover crops improve slug control? And I think it can, but that is through good management, right amount of species, and allowing the slug predators to thrive in your cover crop. Next, please. And next. So what do all these cover crop predators like? Keep pressing for about 5, Christian, please. All these things, that's it. All these things are what will eat slugs, and all these things can be in your cover crop, and they all like shelter. They all like to be hidden away. They don't like bare fields. They don't want to go out into a bare field. So if you can have a reasonable cover crop, give these guys shelter, they will start to impact on your slug problems. We've now found, been doing cover crops for 10 years, haven't grown rape for 4 or 5. I'm starting to think we don't need to use any slug pellets. We don't really. I've had misses on the drill where I'm putting a slug pellet on where it blocks or breaks down, and we don't see any difference. So in most situations now, I don't believe we need slug pellets. and I think that is because we are encouraging these beneficial insects, rodents, mammals in our cover crops, and they are keeping the slug problems in check. There's always going to be slugs there. They're part of the natural cycle. It's just keeping them in balance. Next, please. And next. Right, and next, please. And the other thing we do in our cover crops is, when possible, maybe not on heavy clay, but on other things, is graze our cover crops. And it has been shown that grazing with sheep can reduce slugs by 44%. And that was done in Oregon. So it's a useful way of reducing your slug damage and getting an income from the grazing. Next. Drilling on the green. This is mainly in the autumn, and this field where you see this is a catch crop after winter oilseed rape. So it's winter oilseed rape, volunteers plus 4 or 5 species, and then we drilled wheat into this. And the interesting thing is that slugs don't like to change diet. So if you leave that green for a week, 10 days after you've drilled your wheat crop, the slugs won't hardly touch your wheat until the greenery is gone from the catch crop. They don't like to change their diets in the growing season. They don't have to. Next, please. Next, please. And this is an interesting study in maize. We don't grow maize, but they do a lot in the States. And this is a study by Cornell. And they found in maize that actually slugs lost weight if they only had maize to eat. They really don't want to eat maize. They must have been weighing the slugs. But if you give them an alternative source, as you can see in the background, of cover crop or something else to eat, they won't even touch the maize. So it's providing alternative food sources can help with slugs too. Next, please. And next, please. And also seed dressings. This is again was done in the States in Cornell, and this was with neonic seed dressings. It's not now we can't use them, so it's not necessarily as relevant, but it does highlight that these seed dressings were supposed to deter slugs. I never found that they ever did, and this study in the States found that actually the neonic seed dressings aren't killing the slugs. They're just making the slugs toxic to the predators, and they were reducing the effectiveness of the beetles by 60% on killing the slugs. So you're actually making your slug problem worse by being toxic to your predators. Next, please. And they called it the toxic slug. Next, please. And again. So you think you can be doing something good for your slugs by using a seed dressing, but you can actually be making them worse. And I think that's one thing that we haven't, especially with neonics, we kind of thought that, well, they must be doing good, so let's use them everywhere without really considering what the sort of knock-on effects to the beneficials was of what we were doing. So about 4 or 5 things here. If you can just click on 4 or 5, please, Christian. That's it. Just things to consider for slugs and cover crops. Timing destruction. In the autumn, leave it late. In the spring, try and do it a bit earlier. Grazing helps. Don't put too many brassicas in, or don't put any brassicas in. Seed dressings, be careful. And we did, to start with, when planting after a cover crop, was apply a low dose of pellets at drilling, just so it gives you that week, 10 days of grace to allow your crop to establish. But I don't think we need to do that anymore. But that was sort of proactive in the early years, was just to make sure that the slugs didn't get out of control. Next, please. Weeds is the next thing, and on the poll it did say about something about weeds and cover crops. I think is a difficult one. They can affect it, but it's not very easy to see. And actually, I don't think the cover crops do a huge amount for weeds in the short term in that year. But in the long term, it does. Keep clicking, Christian, please. That's it. I mean, they can do it in various ways. Things like oats can be very allelopathic, and they exude stuff from their roots, which will stop other weeds growing. Shading, just basic competition, encouraging weed predators, and that's one thing that a lot of people don't quite ever think about. All those weed seed predators, like beetles, eat weed seeds. Again, they like shelter. And if you click again, please. And there's a study done in the States again, and they found that these weed seed predators were 3 to 4 times more prevalent in cover crop fields compared to bare fields. So I think over the long term, you can start to reduce your weed seed bank in the surface with cover crops, but it's something you've got to be slightly careful of in the early years to not make your weeds worse. I think we've found that sometimes our grass weeds have got worse in a spring crop, and I don't think that's the cover crop. I think that's just because it's things like peas and beans aren't very competitive and quite open in the spring, and it allows the weeds to go. So it's not necessarily the cover crop, it's more the following cash crop. Next, please. And again, and again. So catch cropping is something we do, and that is just between autumn crops. And if it goes well, if you get enough moisture, you can get a crop like that in 6 weeks in the south, maybe not up in Pip in the northeast. And that is obviously going to be full of beneficials. When you walk into that field, you can hear it. There's everything buzzing around. And for me, that's a great thing. If that's going into wheat, after that, all those beneficials are then around to eat any aphids or any pests or slugs or whatever in our wheat crop. Keep going. And I also like catch crops because for me it's breaking the disease cycle. Even though you're growing two say cereals, 2 wheats, if you have this in between, you are having a mini break. So things like take-all and stuff, you are giving it a short break, adding diversity, changing the soil microbiology, so you should get less issue with diseases, soil-borne diseases in the following second wheat, which I'll get onto in a sec. Next, please. So take-all will be one of them. If you just click through 2 or 3 times, and you can go back again, please. Sorry. So what are the causes of take-all? For me, it's not the lack of seed dressings. We haven't used latitude seed dressing in wheat for a long time. It's very expensive, and I'm not sure it does very much. For me, take-all a lot is about soil health and nutrition. The more diverse your soil microbiology, the less likely that take-all will take hold, and also nutrition. And we saw the nutrition in quite starkly a few years ago in our wheat. If you go forward, Christian, please. And again, so this was a field of wheat, and this was a field of second wheat, and the yield there in that red spot there was, when you walked it, you could see about 5–10% of the wheat plants had take-all, and it was in a specific area. And I thought to myself, well, that's a bit strange that it's just there, not the whole field. There's a spring line across there as well. And so I thought, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get that tested for Lyme and see if that's something that is causing this take-all into a specific area. So we did, and you click on, please. And as you can see across that in that field, that is exactly where the low Lyme was. So take-all was nothing to do with having no seed dressings, no latitude. It was a fact that field needed liming in those places. So nutrition plays a huge amount in terms of healthy plants, healthy crops can resist pests, whether that's soil-borne or foliar. Next, please. And again, BYDV, we haven't done anything for BYDV chemically for 3 years, and I'm not sure we've hardly ever sprayed foliar insecticides for BYDV. We did used to use neonics when they were around, but I wouldn't now if they came back. But what it means, again, what are the underlying causes of BYDV? You can click on. Is it lack of seed dressings? I don't think so. Insecticide resistance? No. Geographical location can make the pressure higher. All of these are a bit tongue-in-cheek, really. These aren't the causes of barley yellowwood dwarf virus. The causes are in the field and in the landscape. Next, please. And again, so this really highlighted it for me. We 3 or 4 years ago, we decided not to do absolutely nothing for BYDV in terms of chemically. And we had a few patches, few parts of field that got really affected with BYDV. I was thinking, crikey, what's going on there? And then I started to look at the soil and soil maps. And if you look at that field there where the lighter green is compared to the blue, that is sandier soil at the top of the hill and going down into heavier ground. And we did see over winter with all the heavy rain that we did get manganese deficiency in the top of that field. And the same on some other light ground, we also saw manganese deficiency. Click on, and that's showing the different underlying soil types. So what we found was the reason that we were getting BYDV is because we had manganese deficiency. And so now anywhere where it's light ground, we'll get manganese once or twice in the autumn. And last year we didn't see any BYDV where we did this, and hopefully not again. So again, BYDV can happen for a lot of reasons, but if you've got a healthy plant, that you're reducing your chance of BYDV, the higher the bricks, that really is the way, one of the best ways to make sure BYDV is not a problem. There is many others as well. If you click, Christian, please. So high bricks plant, which is basically more sugars, a healthier plant. Foliar nutrition, I've talked about manganese. It could be something else on your farm that's causing the imbalance. Healthy soils. As I said, we monitor the poorer soils. You normally won't, the more fertile parts of your field probably won't get BYDV. It's probably the more the poorer parts. Encourage predators, again, no-till, having stubble. That's been shown scientifically that retaining stubble, tall stubble, residue can reduce BYDV. Having bare brown ground is one good way of allowing the aphids to see where your crop is. Sticky traps, grazing. Grazing is of the autumn crop to take away the leaf, which is done in organic. Varietal resistance is coming, but it's varietal tolerance, should I say. It's not necessarily resistance. And companion cropping. And if you click on, this is something I've been playing with in the last couple of years. Click again. The idea of adding diversity into your wheat crop in the autumn to sort of confuse the aphids, add healthier plants by adding a companion to our wheat crop. And this is in the literature. These are the few that I found have been found to be good for deterring aphids. Most of them are no use in our country. Click on. So what we decided to do, and again, please, last year I tried 5 or 6 different species, and I also did the normal pre-emergence as well on these, so they have to be able to take the hit from the pre-emergence. And what we found in the end was the bottom 2 survived the pre-em and survived the winter, and were there in the spring in the crop, and then were sprayed out. There's many other reasons for doing this in terms of improving drainage, improving nutrient, holding on to nutrients throughout the winter as well. But we found the vetch and the beans were the two that work for us. And so again, this year, if you click on, from last year, we found a 0.2 of a hectare, forward please, 0.2 of a hectare yield increase from the companion crop. I think we can do better than that. That only really just paid for the seed, but the many other benefits of having diversity, as in below, as well. It's something we're working on. But this year, if you could click on. This year, I've just done a field of beans. I prefer to use vetch, but I didn't have the seed at the time. So I've got a side-by-side trial. I believe on the heavier, poorer soils, we're going to see a lot more benefit yield-wise with this. Last year, we didn't have any BYDV, so we couldn't test to see whether there's any differences between the two. But this year, we'll see. But it's something that I'm trying to add diversity to our cropping. And winter wheat is 40% of our crop, so I'm trying to add diversity into that winter wheat, and I think companion cropping is a good way of doing that. I just need to work out the ins and outs. Next, please. Cabbage stem flea beetle. I've stopped growing this stuff for oilseed rape for the last 4 or 5 years. Nothing to do with flea beetle. That was to do with verticillium wilt. My grandfather was growing rape on this farm, so it's been growing for a long time, and I think a lot of our ground just became rape sick. If you just click through, Christian, but this is from Jake Freestone in the Gloucestershire, Worcestershire area. Keep going. That's it. He's back. He's been growing companion crops with his inter oilseed rape, and it's the first companion crop that I did back in 2013 with our oilseed rape. His is vetch and buckwheat like we used to do as well. And companion cropping isn't going to solve your cabbage stem flea beetle issues, but it is one tool in the armory to help. And what Jake has found is he can use less insecticide, less fertilizer, less herbicide, because he's using the companion crop in his oilseed rape, and that's before you start talking about the yield increases of about 0.2, 0.3 tonne a hectare from the companion crop. So it is, as I say, it's like all these IPM things, they'll work in certain years, certain times, but you don't necessarily know which year you're going into. So, but they're a good way of helping you reduce the risk. Next, please. Plant disease, and this is where we get into my intercropping, which is growing more than one crop at the same time. And this picture is spring oats and spring beans, and the main crop is spring beans. And for us growing spring beans, two of the major issues are weeds. There's not really anything you can spray, very little in spring beans, and disease. Either in a wet year it's chocolate spot, in a dry year it's rust. There's been a lot of literature and work done going back 30 years showing if you mix cereals and legumes together, you'll get lower disease. And I'm in the 4th year of doing this. And last year with the PGRO, we did a trial actually looking at disease. And if you click, you see the results. So beans, and 50 is the seeds per plants per squared meter. So the top one is just beans by itself, and the bottom two are the ones where they're mixed. No, ignore the other ones, was just a bit of an idea of PGRO of having strips across the field, which kind of work, but not as well. As you can see, there's sort of a 75% reduction in disease by having the plants mixed together. For us, that's huge. The problem with rust and chocolate spot is they can take over your crop before you've even realised, and you can go back and they're being defoliated. So this really gives us protection and gives us time. If there is a real bad disease problem, we might have to go into fungicide. Last year we spent £8 a hectare on fungicide on our beans, and I think we can probably get away in most years with nothing now. Now we're doing it with oats. But it's just a way of mixing your crops, a great way of IPM, of reducing the risk of disease. There'll still be disease in there, as you can see, 10%, but it doesn't take off, or less likely to take off. Next, please. And this is just some results from the trial the year before. Keep clicking through. Next one. This is the yields of the two. So we found the yield was a lot higher where we mixed the two. Next one. Next one. Land equivalent ratio is basically, you can see we were getting about 30% more crop off 1 hectare of land when you have them mixed compared to when you have them by themselves. Next one. And then just the gross output, we were getting a lot higher income from mixing the two. That was in 2019. In 2020, the benefit was not as great. We're about £40 to £50 a hectare better off having them mixed. But again, as I said, it doesn't work consistently the same amount every year. It just depends on the field, the year, the weather, and what happens. But we haven't found that we lost anything yet, which is important. Next. Simple way of reducing disease in your wheat or barley or anything is just by mixing your varieties. Again, the work has been done on this 30, 40 years, showing that the mixture of varieties, having 3 or 4 different varieties of the same crop in the field, can really reduce your disease pressure. Adrian Newton in Scotland's done a lot of work on this. And if you go one step further, wheat population variety, which is the man Martin Wolf in the picture there, he designed a wheat population variety called Wakeland's YQ. And the basic idea of that is that nearly every plant in that field is genetically different. So there's nothing the same. So they all have different disease scores, and that diversity means to significantly reduce disease in the crop. We're growing it for the first time this year, and from what I've been told, I shouldn't really need a fungicide on that wheat crop. It won't yield quite as much as some other varieties, but as a premium, hopefully get a premium for it. But I'm also looking to add that in to a mixture of more modern varieties, the Crusoes and the Zayats, and having a mixture of all of those to keep the yield, but also reduce the disease burden. The one thing I've got to be careful, being a Group 1 milling wheat grower, is that the mill will take it. That is the one problem with milling wheat. With feed wheat and feed barley, that's not an issue at all. But it's a very simple way, which means of adding diversity without having to separate crops or have drills to plant different crops, different depths. Just if you add diversity to the genetics within your field with this. Next one, please. Weeds, intercrops and weeds. This is from an organic farm in Wiltshire, and they are having real severe problems with wild oats in their beans, winter beans. And what they did was started to grow winter beans and winter wheat together. So the wheat was acting as suppressing the oats. And those, one on the left is one that's been grown with wheat, and the one on the right is an oat without wheat, just beans by itself. If you click next, please. And what they find, and this is normally what you find with weeds, it's not necessarily, you don't reduce the number of weeds, you reduce the biomass of weeds. And they got 75%, 74% less biomass of oats in their intercrops with the wheat than they did with beans, and for them that was a big advantage, because their bean yields really were struggling with beans by themselves, just getting smothered by the oats. Next, please. And this is an example of, again, we saw this last year in our Marifat peas, and we're trialing growing marrow fat peas with spring oats. The main reason is for reduced lodging of the peas, so the oats will hold the peas up, and so it's a lot easier to harvest and they're not on the floor. But this year we did find that we had, where we'd sprayed in the monoculture, we had the same weeds as where we didn't spray in the intercrop, or had less herbicides. And if you look at the next table, if you can go on, I've highlighted that the plots without oats, we were spending nearly £80 a hectare on weeds. Most of that was bentazone, I think, and without was 18.35. So that's sort of a £60 a hectare difference in herbicide cost just by intercropping. And if financially it was about the same outcome, slightly less yield of peas, but I'm working on that one. We're doing a trial again this year. But it was quite surprising to see the effect that the oats had on the peas. And going forward with less and less herbicides, less and less chemicals, we're going to have to start thinking about these secondary crops for performing such things as weed control, because we're not going to have anything else. Next, please. This is an interesting one that happened was really by accident and really by just by observation. So 3 years ago we were growing spring linseed, and it was getting absolutely hammered by flax flea beetle. So what happens is as soon as that linseed comes through the ground, these flax flea beetles seem to be able to find them, and they come and they keep chewing and chewing and chewing. And that we ended up spraying those fields 3 times with insecticides. And did it do much good? Maybe, just. But it certainly didn't stop them. It wasn't a very good crop of linseed in the end. But walking across that field, I noticed when I was walking across, and in this picture, there's a patch of wild oats. And the linseed where the patch of wild oats was fine. It was growing completely normally, very little damage. So a light bulb went off in my head saying, right, when I grow linseed next year, I need to trial it with the oats as a companion crop to help deter the flax flea beetle. So that's what we did in 2019. Click across. So we tried different seed rates of linseed and oats. And interestingly enough, all these ideas aren't necessarily new, because when I started looking into this, I found a paper from the 1930s where they used to grow linseed and oats. So like most things, nothing is new in the world. But we tried 0, 70 plants per square meter and 140 to see how much we would need of linseed to oats to help linseed. If you click again, please. And this is the pest damage score. So you can see the lower where the oats are with 140 and 70, there's a lot less pest damage. And this work was done, it was a proper scientific trial, not done by me scoring it. Next one, please. And this one is the growth stage. So interesting enough, we found that the more oats there was, the taller and faster growing the linseed was. Whether that's through competition or plant health, we're not sure. But that's what you basically want with linseed. You want it to get out of the ground and grow very fast to get away from the flax flea beetle. Next, please. And plant counts, and this was visible all through the season up until harvest. There was a lot more plants where we had the oats, and the oats are sprayed out 6 to 8 weeks after establishment. Once the linseed is established, you can spray out the oats before they compete. And it was easy to see walking across the plots, even at harvest where we hadn't had any oats, because it was a lot thinner and a lot patchier. Next, please. And this was the yield results from this. So we actually found we got 20% more yield from having just having oats with the linseed just for 6-8 weeks at the start of the crop growing cycle. So for us, it's made a big difference. Last year we did the same, but it was a low flax flea beetle year. so we didn't necessarily see a huge amount of benefit, but you don't know what the year is going to be until the crop is up, so you can't add in the oats afterwards. But 70 plants per square metre of oats is very cheap. That's been a big success for us, and I'd never grow linseed now without a companion crop of oats. Next, please. And that is it. Questions?
I think we could do a whole nother webinar just on the questions that are coming in for you, Andy.
Okay, that's fine.
Are you ready? I can 100% see why when you answered the question at the beginning about time, how it isn't possible to wish time away. So yeah, I don't know if the other guys want to come in as well. Please, if you have any thoughts or opinions, chip in as well, and we'll do our best to get through these questions, but just conscious of time disappearing on us now. So if we just, I think we'll just go for it. How do you market your mixed species grain, i.e. bean and cereal, for example?
I separate them. But if you've got livestock, they make a good feed. Peas and barley and peas, barley, oats. I mean, it's all these things are. If you've got your own livestock, it makes great feed or forage. And again, nothing's new in the world. Dredge corn was something done 50, 60 years ago, which is a mixture of different cereals, which was used to feed animals. But yeah, no, we've got a separator, so we separate them on farm and sell them separately. So you do have to be careful what you grow together. Linseed and oats, I have grown them together in a plot, and they're not very easy to separate. So you have to be careful.
And weeds add diversity, but also cause yield reductions. How is companion planting different, or are you seeing yield reductions but lower costs?
It depends. So the companion planting with the linseed, because we spray it out as soon as possible. The oats, because you don't want the competition, because the oats can be very competitive. With the beans and the oats, you do lose some bean yield, but you get the oat yield, so you're making up for it because you're selling both. But you do have to be careful. With our peas, they're high value, so I don't want to put too many oats with them and lose too much pea yield. Otherwise, I'm worse off. But if you're an organic farmer, where you don't have the option of any herbicides or anything, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Or you get organic spring beans can be half a ton a hectare to 4 ton a hectare. It just depends whether they get chocolate spot or rust. And if you can reduce that by mixing crops, all the better.
And actually, this question's from Richard, so I don't know if you want to elaborate on this at all, but is cover crops / improved soil health giving more soil resilience to severe weather conditions?
Is that to me or Richard? From Richard.
Sorry, from Richard to you. I didn't know whether Richard wanted to elaborate on it at all.
Yeah, well, it's just, I suppose this last 2 or 3 years, it's been a major topic with us in this country that establishing autumn crops or even cover crops, or with us, it can lead to the complete opposite, drought in the spring. And we're trying to build resilience in the soil there, that we don't have the extremes on both sides, too wet to drill and you've no crop, or too dry in the spring and your crop dies off. And we're trying to work on that obviously with our cover crops. I'm just wondering, with Andy being further ahead, has he any experience of that giving him a better resilience in extreme conditions?
Yes, and the example of last autumn or autumn 19, we managed to get all our crops in, whether that was because our soil was in good health, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, because they obviously struggled going in late October and then it didn't stop raining. But what I say to people is it didn't cost us very much to do it. We just no-tilled them in, seed, home saved seed, and that was it. But the resilience, I think it is there, but if it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain. You can save a bit of water through improving your soil health, but a lot of problem we have in the southeast here is actually the heat. we get to June and we get 2-3 weeks of 30 degrees, our spring beans and peas just stop flowering. So heat can actually be worse than the drought, and that's where, for me, the intercropping comes in, because if you've got it very hot or very dry, that might suit one of your intercrops more than the other. So at least you're spreading your risk. In terms of soil health, yes, it certainly makes it easier to work the soil, and you can get crops in easier, cheaper. But it's very difficult to put a pounds, pennies and pence, on that one. And I think it's going to take another 10-20 years as well, probably.
So then I've sort of got a two-part question here. Can you tell us what sort of drill you use? But then following that, on catch crops, have you got any experience on broadcasting the cover into a standing crop pre-harvest or even earlier? If so, which species have you found successful?
Drill shouldn't really matter. It's always one of the first questions people ask. But I used to have a John Deere 750A and a Simtech, and with the help of a nice European grant, I managed to swap them both in for a cross slot. The main reason I got a cross slot, a second-hand one from Ireland, was because it had 3 hoppers on that, and it meant I could plant my intercrops all in one go, and separate and have separate seed and different depths. So that was the main reason. And the second part, what was the second part again? Sorry, just remind me again.
Oh, I have to find it out. On catch crops, have you got any experience on broadcasting the cover crop into a standing crop pre-harvest or even?
We have got some experience, and the smaller seeds are the ones that work well. So this year, last harvest, I bought an auto cast for £1,000 and stuck that on our back of our combine header. And this year, I'm looking for sort of an outcast to do it in our later harvested crops, sort of like the spring beans and things that are planted harvested end of August, beginning of September. I'm planning on catch cropping absolutely everything if possible. It is a smaller seeds, and ones that worked well this year were Phacelia, Berseem clover, linseed, and buckwheat. And I did that for about £10 a hectare. And even with a very dry year this year, we got sort of foot worth of growth, 12 inches of growth, which for me is plenty. In a wet year, you can get 3 foot, 3, 4, 5 foot of growth. So it does work, but you've got to be accepted if you're broadcasting that it's not going to be as even and as reliable as drilling.
Fab. So just conscious of time now. Pip, I didn't know, have you got anything else that you would like to ask or add?
Yeah, I've got a question for Andy, actually. Very interesting, your mixes of your companion crops. I've played around with crimson clover for the last couple of years, and I struggled to get it to grow up north. Is there any other clovers you've used within your crops, or why do you major on crimson clover?
Berseem clover, that's great. We use, but I find Berseem clover grows in most conditions. White clovers can be hit and miss with us. We've tried to undersow them, and I think half the problem with white clovers, especially if you're undersowing, can be herbicide residue. Very sensitive to that. Slugs sometimes, or just the sort of the little insects that hammer it as it's just coming through. But I just find Berseem clover for us is more reliable.
Right.
But then I'm 350 miles south of you, so that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I've had a lot of trouble establishing it and getting it to take. So,
are you trying to just do that, or are you trying to add things in? Because again, you might need a companion for your clover.
Well, actually, I've been using the clover in my grass lays and my legume-rich swards, and I've tried to integrate, and I struggle with it, to be honest with you. I don't think it likes it this far north, if the truth be known.
No, possibly not.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much. I don't know whether Henry, Richard, have you got anything else you'd like to add before we close for the evening?
I think just sort of a point that was raised earlier, you know, can individual farms increase the diversity? You know, I think Andy's made a good point showing that by companion cropping, he's not really taking away his cash or his income crop. He's still growing his wheat or his peas or beans. But by intercropping and adding that diversity, he's brought the diversity into his rotation without affecting his end result. So he's still growing the crops that he needs for the market that he's working with. But by adding that diversity and having a wee bit of foresight and putting those crops in, which is actually benefiting them in other ways, but it shows that it can be done on an individual farm basis. And if people put that bit of thought in, we don't need to be dictated how to do it. It can be done. And very well.
What I will say is that it's trial and error. I've had lots of failures, but it is just trying a little bit. Don't just because I said tonight wheat and oats and beans go well together. Don't go and do your whole farm. Try a bit in your area and see what works for you. It might be completely different, but don't be scared to fail either. I think that's quite a key one. Some people don't like failing, but you don't learn unless you fail. And I do a lot of learning.
No,
I think a lot of those key lessons are the same for IPM as well. It's what's going to be suitable for your situation may not be suitable for your neighbours even. But again, Andrew's talking about, and Richard's talking about, diversity is key. Using multi-pronged approaches, where we're hitting the pest, whatever it is, with everything we've got, whether it's rotation, varieties, cultivations, and pesticides as well. It's all about sort of bringing that diversity in and building resilience from that.
I think that's the fab conclusion to close on. Sorry, Richard, were you just going to say something then?
I was going to actually ask maybe Henry a question, and it sort of was a leading question maybe, but
yeah, go for it.
Does anybody feel that, you know, the improvement in modern machinery and the availability of chemicals actually held farming back for the last number of years, and would be further forward if we hadn't got some of the chemicals or machines that we have or have used and are not using anymore?
Yeah, sure. I think we all know there is an over reliance on pesticides, or there certainly has been, and I think that's unfortunately that's the way the funding was sort of channeled as well. It was towards improved varieties or improved pesticides, and the other sort of IPM measures and ICM measures that Andrew's talked about today, some of them they've kind of been neglected a little bit. So I think this is why we're starting to do more trials where we're looking at sowing dates and fertilizer regimes and tillage regimes and how that will affect pests, and by pests I mean everything, including weeds and diseases as well. But hopefully things are coming back the other way now, because we've realised that we're losing these pesticides because they're becoming less effective, because we're getting resistance to these pesticides in the pest populations, but we're also having a lot of pesticides being revoked, which is sort of forcing people to go down the IPM route. Unfortunately, you don't want to be starting from a standing start when the wheels do come off and these pesticides are taken away, or there's a massive drop in efficacy. So the more work you do now to gradually improve the resilience of your business, bringing in those sort of ICM, IPM techniques, you're going to be on a better footing when the worst does happen.
One thing I didn't mention is nitrogen fertilizer, and we know that is probably one of the biggest driver of pest and disease is excessive nitrogen fertilizer, and people always put on pretty well too much. I think that's one thing that the industry is going to have to grapple with in the next 10-20 years, because there's going to be a carbon tax on it. It's going to become very expensive. Polluter pays kind of stuff. A lot of these things don't necessarily work if you've put 300 kilograms of nitrogen on your wheat. That completely drives the system to a very weak system. So I think that's something that I didn't mention in my talk. didn't have time, but I think it's very important.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much for giving up your time this evening and join us. If anybody does have any burning questions following this webinar, don't hesitate to get in touch. So just quickly to mention, all our publications and further information on any of the subjects covered this evening are available on our website. Please just visit the publications page. We also, following on from that, have a broad range of tools to help with everything from benchmarking costs and the machinery costing calculator, for example, to choosing varieties for farm. So same again, do take a look at our website for any further information and keep checking back as these are regularly updated as well. So just to finish with tonight, our Monitor Farm survey. Please just take 2 minutes and fill it in. If nothing else, you're in for a chance to win a hamper worth £50. But your opinions and feedback are always really appreciated. Please go to our website, which again is on there, ahdb.org.uk, and fill out the survey. It's the best format we have to measure the success and continually improve the programme for you. And actually, this is the last of the Monitor Farm Monday series that we've been running this winter. So as of next month, we will go back to our monthly Wednesday webinar. But please keep an eye on the website again, /events, and also your email will keep you updated on there. As I've said already, this has been recorded, so if you want to go back and listen to it again, please do. If anybody hasn't put their Narosa and basis points in the chat box on the right-hand side, do that now and Christian will collate those. And like I say, if you've got any burning questions following this webinar, don't hesitate to get in touch. But as always, Natalie and Christian, who are hiding in the background, thank you so much for your support this evening. Richard, Pip, Henry, Andy, thank you all very much for your input. It's been fab to see you and really very interesting. So thank you all very much and good night.